Hey Hunters, HaloZoo here, back for more D&D 5.5 stuff. This is not the Cleric class, taking a break from that just because Cleric is a big class, and having to work through 8 archetypes, not the easiest, and Wizard is the same way, so probably going to do Cleric first, but that's probably going to be next week because... yeah, it's going to take a bit more to work on. Regardless, we're going to be looking at the Cantrips of 5.5. So this is going to be the Cantrips getting Errata in 5.5, as well as the new Cantrips for 5.5 that are coming with 5.5. This won't include any of the new to 5e spells. It's just the ones new to 5.5 and the ones getting errata that's not like spell list errata. So it's not going to go list all the ones that have moved to new classes. Instead, it's just, hey, here's the ones that have changed mechanically, not just who gets them. So anyway, let us go into the first spell getting errata, Blade Ward. So this is mostly the same up through here. However, and at the bottom you'll actually see some notes. This is just basically a general synopsis of the change. So Blade Ward, of course, there is a new damage type, Bleed, which has been added to Blade Ward because it's a physical damage type, so it's been added to Blade Ward, and it's actually going to affect all physical damage types, physical damage that isn't from falling. So falling damage is not negated, but it's no longer just from weapons. So simple enough change to where it's like, yeah, it's not much, still not a great cantrip, but at the very least it's sort of like, hey, here's a few changes to make it fit in a little better with how, and just to kind of like tweak it a little, make it a bit better, and also have it be where it supports the new damage type. So Booming Blade. So very simple change to this spell. Material component is just a weapon that costs at least 1 copper piece. Doesn't matter what the weapon is. If it's a weapon, then it works. But anyway, the change is simple. The attack that you make also deals thunder damage now. So basically it's like if you use a longsword with it, then it's thunder and slashing damage on the base attack. So think of it this way, like it's just a simple change to make it where it's like, hey, this spell does some stuff while like it affects your base attack with the damage type to kind of make more sense, you know? Then we have Create Bonfire. And also you will notice some new classes get stuff like Blade Ward is available to Mist Blade and Sword Mage. Booming Blade is added to Sword Mage, which is a new. Those two are new classes. Create Bonfire also shows up on the Shaman spell list, which is another new class. But yeah, Create Bonfire lasts a minute still, but it now sheds 10 feet of dim light. Just because, like, it's a fire. Like, of course it shines some light. Made sure not to give it any bright light, just because it would be kind of powerful if it did. But its damage has been lowered to D6. But it also lost concentration and gained in its concentration's place. You can only have one active at a time. So As you can see, it's just shed some light, D6 now, and remove concentration. And that's actually why the damage got nerfed, because I wanted to make sure it wasn't too powerful for what it is. So it did lose some damage, but that shouldn't be too big when you're losing concentration as well. So you can actually reasonably use it. Dancing lights. So these have a very simple change as well. They lost concentration, which they never should have had, honestly. And you can only have one active at a time, which just means that you now have one dancing light spell active. However, you're also going to notice that these now shed 5 feet bright light, 5 feet dim light. So instead of 10 feet dim light, which has actually been moved over to create Bonfire, this now has 10-foot light still, but half of it's bright. Simple buff to make it like actually useful, in all honesty. It's like, hey, you might actually want the spell. Especially on ranged casters. It's like, it's actually reasonable to use. And, of course, this shows up for Mistblade and Sword Mage. Frostbite also shows up on Shaman and Sword Mage. I don't think any of these actually got moved to other classes. Not as many Errata Cantrips, but anyway. Frostbite, simple enough. So you will notice that this now affects all attack rolls, but is a flat -2. That's pretty much it. Everything else, and that actually is going to be for all sort of like penalty stuff from combat cantrips. Just to kind of make it where it's like, okay, look, these aren't supposed to be that powerful, so we're just going to make it a flat penalty instead. And also specifically, if you have something else that gives advantage or disadvantage, it stacks with that. So it's kind of like it's got a buff and a nerf in some ways. So it's there. And it's still good. Like, it should still be good, but it's just kind of pulled back a little bit from being too powerful of a downside, or of a penalty, because it's a cantrip. Green Flame Blade, just as with Booming Blade, it's been added to the Sword Mage. Just need a weapon that costs 1 copper piece. And the base attack now deals fire damage, so if you're using like a Warhammer, then it's going to be bludgeoning and fire, battle axes, slashing and fire, etc., etc. So you're going to see that the base damage is now partly elemental. Simple, like it's all simple changes, really. Lightning Lure, very simple change. It always deals damage now. It's guaranteed damage. And it's also moved over to Sword Mage, because it's technically counted within the blade spells. So it's very simple as like, hey, this always does damage. This is partly because certain classes, you can get various range buffs to it. So instead of saying, oh, hey, if it's adjacent to you now, or in 5 feet, then you deal damage. No, it's always going to do damage now. Magic Stones. This one has changed a bit. So you can only have 1 Magic Stones. Duration is increased by 10 times. So it's now 10 minutes. This is just like, hey, if you, like, you can hold these for a bit longer. And these have also been changed to no longer be spell attacks. These are now weapon attacks. So they count as weapons. That's important. So they've been changed over to being weapon attacks, and they still use your spell mod for the attack and damage rolls, but Otherwise, they work the same, but you'll also notice they now scale at higher levels, getting +1 to the attack rolls and damage rolls at 5th, 11th, and 17th levels. So basically, they scale like magic. They have magic weapon scaling automatically with this. Now, keep in mind, they aren't great as like weapons, but they are serviceable. And this should allow for some unique interactions with certain builds, and can kind of turn you into more of a, kind of put you in a unique direction. This is also available to Shaman, which, for reference, Shaman are basically kind of like Druids with their spellcasting choices. While Mistblades, as an Arcane Halfcaster, only have utility spells on their list, so you won't see any combat spells. But this spell, like, it works roughly the same at base. It's just some of the things have been tweaked around to kind of tweak what it works with. And also, they've had the addition of having scaling now. And we'll see that scaling return in the future. Mind Sliver only changes that it's now flat -2. Not 1 to 4, just -2. So it's still, like, it's not as powerful, or potentially as powerful, but it is still useful. So it's also been moved over to Sword Mage. Simple enough. Produce Flame. So this has changed a bit. Now, Produce Flame is a bonus action to cast. As a result, you do lose the ability to attack with it immediately, but at the same time, that's not technically lost, because you can just attack the same turn with it. And it also doesn't end the spell when you attack, and you instead conjure a new one immediately. Also, you'll notice the base range has been increased to 60 feet. The biggest problem with Druid solved. You no longer require Spell Sniper to function decently at first level, at low levels. It's that good of a buff. And also, as an additional aside, you no longer need a hand free, as you can put it on your spellcasting focus. So if you're like using a staff and shield, then it's summoned on your staff. More of an aesthetic change, but it's a cool one. Because why not have like a flame? Use your staff like a torch. Shillelagh. So this one, its duration has been increased by 10 times, and it's also gained magic weapon scaling at higher levels. So this should hopefully make Shillelagh actually keep up with other spells in Cantrips, where it's more accurate and has better consistency, but it doesn't do as much damage as the other options. But, you know, consistency is still useful. So, that's Shillelagh. Toll the Dead. Simple nerf. That is, honestly, in my opinion, very, very necessary. The damage boost is half health or lower. It's no longer if it's lost any HP. Oh no, it's if it's at half HP or lower already. So, yeah. And Shillelagh's also on Shaman now, not just Druid. Whereas Toll the Dead is available to Invoker and Sword Mage, which I misspelled. There we go. But anyway, this is just to kind of keep it to where it's like, hey, This isn't the absurdly overpowered cantrip it is normally. Instead, it's just good. Not overpowered in any way, in my opinion. True Strike. No longer gives advantage and is now a flat attack roll buff equal to your spell mod. And it's available to Mistblade and Sword Mage. Very simple buff, but it's sort of like, you know, it lets you stack with advantage is the idea, and also makes it less powerful for certain ones. Vicious Mockery. It's also a -2 to attack rolls, just like Frostbite. Simple enough. Some of the errata is subject to change, like I could potentially see Toll the Dead getting changed as again to just kind of pull it back a little bit more. Don't know exactly what I'd do with it, but so this is stuff that's subject to change, but that's currently the errata I have, though some of them probably won't be changed, like Dancing Lights. Like Create Bonfire is probably the most likely to get changed again, where I might nerf its damage again, or bring back concentration but buff the damage instead? I don't know. But may also increase Magic Stones in Shalala's duration even more. Possibly the same with Produce Flame. I don't know, but we'll see. So there is some change, but anyway, that's the errata cantrips. Let's look at what the new stuff is. Starting alphabetically, we have Bone Talon, available to the Cleric, Sorcerer, Warlock, Wizard, Invoker, and Sword Mage. It's a Necromancy cantrip, standard action, 120-foot range base, and its verbal somatic components. Pretty much almost all of these are. It's an instant, and you launch a Bone Spike at a target in range, dealing D4 slashing damage. It's a ranged spell attack. It deals D4 slashing damage plus spell mod necrotic damage. And at higher levels, it's plus 1d4 slashing damage per rank, basically. So, then we have Electric Bolt, available to Druid, Sorcerer, Wizard, Shaman, and Sword Mage. I will pre-warn you, this is the most likely to be different and changed, but right now it's kind of meh. Evocation, standard action, 120-foot range, verbal somatic, simple enough. No duration. It's just Firebolt, but lightning. Yeah, kind of bland. But hey, it's like I wanted to add a single target lightning cantrip, so this is kind of a placeholder. It might actually be like this, but I don't know. We'll see. Energy Ward. Available to everyone who has Blade Ward, Bard, Sorcerer, Warlock, Wizard, Mistblade, and Sword Mage. Abjuration cantrip, standard action, self-range, verbal somatic, lasts around, and it's similar to Blade Ward. Basically, however, it is a bit different. So you choose 2 of the following energy damage types, which are Acid, Cold, Fire, Force, Lightning, Necrotic, Poison, Psychic, Radiant, and or Thunder. And you have resistance to those 2 till the end of your next turn. So I did make sure that it wasn't all of them, because resistance to 10 damage types is a bit crazy to have it once, so it's just 2. So you will, and you know, like it's just a kind of like, hey, here's a slightly different Blade Ward. Simple enough. Frozen Slash, available to Sorcerer, Warlock, Wizard, and Sword Mage. Evocation cantrip, standard action, self, as a somatic and material component, which is a weapon that costs at least 1 copper piece, and it lasts around. So, You make a weapon attack using a melee weapon you're wielding that deals cold damage in addition to its other normal types. And the target speed is reduced by 10 feet until the start of your next turn on hit. And of course, as a blade spell, you add plus d8 cold damage at 5th, 11th, and 17th levels. So basically, it's a cold blade spell, or a cold-themed blade spell that also slows. So it kind of adds it's a pretty cool blade spell, in my opinion. Up next, we have Kinetic Lance, available to Sorcerer, Wizard, and Sword Mage. Evocation, standard action, and it actually launches in a 30-foot line with verbal and somatic components. And it's just a Spear of Force, 30 foot long, 5 foot wide, originating from your space. Each creature in the line must make a dex save or take d8 force damage, and that's plus 1d8 per rank. So a very simple idea to kind of add like a line damage cantrip, which it's kind of like an interesting new addition, you know, like kind of change things up a bit. Phantom Blade. This one has a text box. I just realized that that's got the wrong range. It's supposed to have a range of self, and is actually I forgot so much. So this is an illusion cantrip that's a bonus action to cast, and it's got a range of self, available to Bard, Sorcerer, Warlock, and Wizard. It's only got a somatic component and lasts 10 minutes. So you conjure a spectral dagger in your hand for the duration. Works similar to a normal dagger, but deals psychic damage instead of piercing damage, and can use your spell modifier for the attack and damage rolls. After you make a ranged weapon attack with the dagger, it instantly vanishes and reappears in your hand. End the spell early as a free action. So you just summon illusionary daggers you can fight with. It's actually kind of like the weakest of a new type of spell, which is the weapon conjuration spells. Except this one's actually an illusion. But also, at higher levels, it gains magic weapon bonus for the daggers. So they basically function like magic daggers at higher levels. And, of course, you must have a hand free to use this spell. One of the only spells that absolutely requires it. And because of this, it also means that it's one of the few spells that kind of ignores Warcaster's requirement. But that is because these don't really make sense to have if you're going to have something in your hand. And it was kind of like an illusionary combat cantrip, but kind of like, you know, what if you made a spectral dagger that you could use? And I do admit that it's kind of similar to Soul Knife, but it's available to more casters. So you absolutely could make like a demi Soul Knife as Arcane Trickster now, which could actually be pretty fun if you do it. Poison Bolt, meanwhile, available to Druid, Sorcerer, Warlock, Wizard, and Shaman. Evocation cantrip, standard action, 60-foot range, verbal and somatic, 1 round duration. Well, kinda 1 round duration. So, you throw a blast of poison at a target in range as a ranged spell attack that deals d4 poison damage on hit. At the start of the target's next turn, if the attack hit, the target must make a con save or take another d4 poison damage. And both the spell attack and saving throw deal an extra d4 damage per rank. This is basically kind of like a actually good poison damage spell, is what this is intended to be, where it's like, hey, look, this is a poison damage spell that actually does reasonable damage. Simple enough, you know? I'm actually thinking about it. I might upgrade. Quick change to this. It's going to be D6 on Bone Talon. to kind of make it more on par with other spells. And also partly to make it on par with Poison Bolt. So basically it's like, it deals damage twice as a kind of like mini dot of sorts. It's still poison damage, but it should be like, hey, here's a poison damage spell you're actually fine using. Unlike the crap that is every other poison damage spell. Then we have Thunderburst. Available to Bard, Druid, Sorcerer, Warlock, Wizard, Shaman, and Sword Mage. Evocation Cantrip. Standard action. 90-foot range with a 5-foot sphere. Verbal and Somatic. Instant. Burst of Thunder explodes around a point in range, creating a sound that can be heard up to 100 feet away. Each creature in a 5-foot radius sphere around that point must make a con save or take 1d4 thunder damage. And the damage increases by 1d4 at 5th, 11th, and 17th levels. So basically it's like a mini AoE spell that also deals thunder damage at a range. That was one of the goals I wanted to do for this. So it's kind of like a mini AoE. It honestly kind of works like Acid Splash in Baldur's Gate 3 in a way, but it's actually Thunderburst doing it, like a new spell that does it. It's a bit weaker, but eh. Ward Strike. Available to Bard, Cleric, Sorcerer, Warlock, Wizard, Invoker, and Sword Mage. It's an Abjuration Cantrip, standard action, with a special self/30-foot range. And it has a verbal and somatic component. So, you have two options with this spell. Either choose yourself, or if there's a creature target in range that has an abjuration spell you cast on them, and then you just make a melee spell attack against a creature object in 5 feet of the chosen target from their space, dealing d6 force damage and pushing up to 5 feet from the chosen target on hit. So basically, either it's just a melee spell attack from yourself, or if, say, you have, like, say you're a cleric and you have a Shield of Faith up, you can also use Shield of Faith to make an attack from yourself, basically. Or from that target and hit someone next to them. So, like, so basically that's why it has this self/30-foot range. And keep in mind, you can technically target creatures up to 35 feet away with this. And it doesn't push away from you, it pushes from the target. So it's kind of a cool idea where it's like, hey, here's this melee spell attack that can also work as a ranged attack of sorts. But it's kind of like, hey, here's an abjuration damage cantrip that plays on the idea of protecting yourself or someone you've warded. Last but not least for the new ones, Wind Blast. Druid, Sorcerer, Wizard, Shaman, and Sword Mage get it. It's a transmutation cantrip for a standard action. Self/15-foot cone. Verbal Somatic. As per usual. I think only 2 spells didn't have Verbal Somatic. Yeah. So, Blast of Wind surges in a 15-foot cone originating from your space. Each creature in the cone must make a strength save or take d4 bludgeoning damage and be pushed up to 5 feet away from you. So basically it's a simple, like, close-range AoE spell. Very light damage and small push, but, you know, it's still a kind of neat little, hey, here's a little cantrip that does cone damage. So without further ado, that has been the 5.5 cantrips. Hope you all find them interesting, and I hope you find the Errata interesting. And as a side note for the Errata, feel free to use pretty much all of it, except, of course, the bleed damage in base 5e. Mostly because, like, hey, these spells already exist. You want to play them like this, go ahead, be my guest. But the rest, like the new stuff, is kind of intended for 5.5. But hey, you can easily transfer it over. But anyway, without further ado, see y'all next time. Halo Zoo out.